So it's a political year, and I felt it would be appropriate to watch and review a political film, Joe, from 1970, directed by John Avildsen, written by Norman Wexler, starring an incredible cast, Joe, a movie about a culture war, the war between the old generation and the new generation, the straights and the hippies. It's, been a public domain staple on VHS for years because it's an early film of Peter Boyle and Susan Sarandon. Within the past decade, though, MGM finally released a legitimate, semi-good-looking DVD version of Joe, and it's worth tracking down. It's an interesting film. I had not seen it. I'd seen pieces of it. I'd read about it through many things, through what I'd read on the director John Avildsen, what I'd read with Lloyd Kaufman's book. Lloyd Kaufman from Trauma. He was a PA, a production assistant for Avildsen, and worked on many of John Avildsen's films. And did a lot of stuff in the area. So anyway, as I said, Joe is about a culture war. It's about this guy, Bill Compton, who's this slick New York ad executive, and he has a daughter played by Susan Sarandon, who is hanging out with this hippie drug dealer, Frank. And basically what happens is Bill accidentally kills this guy, and through a quirk of circumstances he comes into contact with this guy Joe, the title character, the titular Joe Curran, played by Peter Boyle, who is this kind of blue-collar steel worker, and he accidentally meets him in a bar, and Joe accidentally finds out Bill's secret, and as opposed to a blackmail thing, Joe is this guy. He's portrayed as this very kind of traditional right wing, the kind of guy who polishes his guns in his basement while he's listening to good American music. One of those guys, one of these true blue kind of blue collar worker guys, and he sees and he is a guy who says, I'd really like to get one of those hippies, want to kill one of them, and Bill's like, well, I just did that by accident. He just blurts it out, and so this sets about a certain set of circumstances where this high-powered ad executive becomes friends with this blue-collar steel worker, and they kind of empower each other, and they go back and forth, and it leads to a very violent conclusion to the story. So yeah, I mean, a good film. There are a lot of late 60s, early 70s films, those hippy-dippy type of films that are very hard to watch. I mean, they're full of really great performances. Like I'm thinking The Strawberry Statement, or More, or all of those films that involve these hip 60s and 70s actors and stuff. But a lot of them, they're kind of like they're very. I think they're very difficult for modern audiences to get into, because there's something I feel like I'm missing, because there's just some kind of something culturally that you kind of had to be there to get into it, So a lot of those films, even though they're full of interesting actors and well made and well done, and they're kind of I find a lot of them kind of boring and difficult to watch, because it's just like I can't understand every little catchphrase and thing that was going on television and the culture at the time. And really, for the most part, Joe is, I think, a very well-made film, and very easy to understand, even for a modern audience. It's very the conflict within Joe, which is really what the film is about. This conflict between the old and the new, the hippies and the straights. and the violent conflict that these can have, the culture clash, is still rumbling within in our society, even in 2016, when you see what you see in Donald Trump's campaign, and you see in political campaigns especially, you just see these kind of, you know, stereotypes and people, or stereotypes at least being played out in the media, at least. You know, I don't know about real life, but in the media we have all these, you know, very simplistic stereotypes of people and the Americans, and you know, this film, you know, really plays that to the hilt, and the film was a hell of a success. The film, you know, it was released in 1970. I think it was made for less than $200,000, about $160,000. The film grossed $19 million. It was a hit. It made Peter Boyle's career and allowed him to go on and have a great career, to go on and do great films like Young Frankenstein, and then later on go into television, and of course, you know, his late success with Everyone Loves Raymond and that stuff. And then even his co-lead, Dennis Patrick, and the film really is as much about Dennis Patrick as it is about Joe. Even Joe's the title character. Dennis Patrick, who is another great, you know, television actor, you know, who's in pretty much every episodic series from, you know, whatever, Barney Miller to Dark Shadows. He was in everything, I believe. And you know, it's just great, the dynamics between these two characters, because you feel that there is this kind of codependent relationship between these two characters where they kind of feed into each other. And Dennis Patrick is, you know, Joe is kind of like makes him feel better about his murder, that he was doing it for some higher purpose or some, you know, whereas really he just got angry and did this. And then Joe is really, you know, he's this guy with all full of bluster and talk, but he doesn't have the guts to do this stuff. And so you feel like if either of these two people on their own didn't come together, they wouldn't be able to perpetrate the acts which they do. And it's just such a great, you know, dynamic between them two. And we see them go to a 60s orgy. They find themselves, you know, in this kind of orgy sequence. According to Joe, this is the first orgy he's ever been to. You know, that's from the trailer. Susan Sarandon is great in an early role as this kind of very kind of bougie young girl who has found herself in this hovel apartment with this drug-dealing boyfriend. This guy McDermott, who was in The French Connection. You know him from The French Connection. He's like the drug tester from The French Connection, the scientific dude from French Connection. And he only has like 3 credits on the IMDb. He's like in Brian De Palma's first experimental hippy-dippy film, Dionysus, and then Dionysus 69, and French Connection, and Joe. That's pretty much it. And I mean, he's got those. You recognize him immediately. He's got those teeth. He's got those crazy teeth, you know. And it's just like, oh, that's the guy from The French Connection. And so he's great. And even with, you know, this film is full of kind of codependent relationships. You know, that this drug dealer and Susan Sarandon are, you know, again, Susan Sarandon is not really. She doesn't seem to be as much into the whole scene, down with the cause as much. She's just kind of hanging around with this boyfriend because she loves her, she loves him, and that she's going to go on and do what he wants. You know, so again, there's an interesting dynamic. We've seen that first scene that goes on for maybe a little bit too long. We see the relationship between Frank and the Susan Sarandon character, and we see that she's kind of trying to live out this normal fantasy of love with this guy who is you know, shooting up heroin, you know, and he's like, oh, you don't have to do it, you know, but she'll do it because she loves him. So Joe is, again, one of those great cultural, I mean, many people just latched on to Peter Boyle as Joe. You know, I mean, apparently he would walk in the streets in the early 70s and people, oh my God, it's Joe. You know, he became, I mean, it really became a little minor cultural icon figure. You know, this guy who exemplified the rage and the anger of these people who felt that the hippies were, you know, destroying everything they built, destroying society, destroying, you know, American culture with their kind of counterculture values. You know, it was a cultural war, and war with a capital W. I mean, I think the seriousness of you know, the stuff, the violence, the gun violence, and the violent conflict portrayed in this film, I don't think people in the, you know, post 1970s can really recognize how, you know, bad it was in the early 70s. I mean, this film was finished apparently in the early 1970, February 1970, and then in May 1970 it was Kent State. You know, when the student protesters were shot by the National Guard. There were certain towns and certain places in the United States in the South where if you had long hair, or you were the wrong color, or you were not from that town, even if you were not the right people, you were in danger, in grave physical danger. And there was spates of hippie murders in that era, and there was even, you know, right after Joe was released, I read a news story about somebody who had killed a bunch of people, and they tried to have this Joe defense. They tried to say that the guy, his lawyers wanted him to say that he'd watched the movie and that he had been influenced by this thing, and so it was a very serious situation. That there very much was a cultural war. People were really, if you were a young person with long hair at that time, it could be a very very nasty situation if you were caught at the wrong place in the wrong time. So the stuff that seems kind of farcical and far-flung and fantastic in this film, Joe, was at the time very, very, very realistic. Peter Boyle, I think, in some ways regretted the role. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's complex. You read a lot of interviews with him, and the character of Joe was as far away from, I think, the real Peter Boyle as it could be. You know, and that's how it goes in entertainment. Oftentimes people who play against themselves. You know, really nice people can play very nasty people. Very nasty people in real life can play very nice, heroic people. And apparently Peter Boyle was very left-wing, very humanitarian. I think I've read something where Patricia Heaton, the wife in Everybody Loves Raymond, like, you know, portrayed him as this, like, she called him like a pinko commie, you know, joking obviously, but I mean, he was very, very left-wing and very much against anything that the character in this film, Joe Curran, could espouse, because Joe Curran is this kind of, as I said, is blue-collar worker who's racist, sexist, you know, and everything. He's kind of like a very hard version of Archie Bunker. You know, I can't help but think that just culturally that there was this archetype. There was the kind of the Joe archetype that fed into the creation of Archie Bunker, who was a little bit, you know, obviously neutered for television, but I mean, that there was this kind of person, this archetype in the early 70s, this guy who was kind of from a different generation and who wasn't in sync with what the crazy young people were doing. And but I mean, really, when Peter Boyle made this film, he was like 34. He was, you know, really, you know, more part of the hippie generation versus the old generation at that time. But it's interesting. His age, he does kind of make a good pair with Dennis Patrick in the film. I think Peter Boyle, in interviews I've heard, that he was you know, he didn't want to do another kind of role with this kind of violence. I think he felt he'd overplayed the kind of right-wing older guy archetype. You know, I think he felt bad that he was kind of stereotyping a group of people in society, that it wasn't really kind of a level-headed, you know, portrait of that type of person, of that type of American, though it was never really meant to be, you know, this kind of balanced film. It was you know, obviously a satire, a critique, or whatever. And according to some reviews, interviews I've seen, read with Boyle, he didn't want to do this type of role again. But really, the role followed him. I mean, you know, you look at other films he's done, like in the '70s, he was in Taxi Driver, he was the Wizard, you know, and then even as late as into the you know, the '90s, late '90s and 2000s with Monsters Ball, where he played that racist police chief, the father of Billy Bob Thornton in that film, you know, who kind of, you know, eggs his own child onto suicide. I mean, again, you can see, you know, parts of Joe Curran in all of those roles. You know, he just was that kind of, he had that kind of face, he had that kind of persona, you know. It was just, he was a very interesting actor. He's one of the great character actors, really, Peter Boyle. Directed by John Avildsen. John Avildsen, who would go on to make an interesting film with Jack Lemmon called Save the Tiger, and then make a really interesting film with Sylvester Stallone, Rocky, which he would direct Rocky from Sylvester Stallone's own screenplay. Speaking of screenplay, this film has a great script. Great script by Norman Wexler, who was a... I haven't read a lot about Norman Wexler, but he seems like a loose cannon. He seemed like a really weird guy. There's a lot of weird Norman Wexler stories. I think he even got into some legal trouble with the president around this time. I don't know the whole circumstances, but he seemed like a really crazy guy. And this, as I said, this film was released by Cannon Films. The Cannon Films, not the same Cannon Films as you know, the guys in the Israeli guys, but basically it was an American company started by like two guys who were distributing you know, Swedish movies and you know, European type sexy movies, and they financed these low budget productions, and then they were bought out by Golan Globus, who went on and churned out action film after action film, the Chuck Norris and the Charles Bronson. But in the DNA of that company was still this great property, Joe. And in the early 80s, well, really throughout the 80s, there was this, you know, there's a lot of, you know, Cannon Films used to have a lot of unproduced projects. You know, there were a lot of projects that they would put out an ad for in the trades. You know, George Romero's Frankenstein, you know, that was a real one. James Cameron's Spider-Man. George Romero Frankenstein would have been interesting. And one of them was this Citizen Joe, which was going to be Joe like 10 years after he gets out of prison, and he's trying to come to terms with his kids, who are you know, a lot more socially, a lot more liberated than him. And so apparently it was from a script by Leslie Stevens. It's in the ad it says from Leslie Stevens and Peter Boyle. So who knows what the hell that would have been? But again, that's another one of the Cannon Films wild unproduced movies. So what can I say about Joe? In some ways, it's a cultural time capsule about the culture war of the early 70s, which still rages on, but at that point it was at a fever point. It was at a fever pitch where people were wondering what's going to be left of our society. Are we going to tear ourselves to shred? Is there going to be 100 Kent states, you know, across on campuses, you know, throughout the United States? Is it going to be anarchy? Is it going to be insanity? And so think of the kind of cultural context of the people at that time, the heady times of the late 60s and early 70s when you watch Joe, and I think it'll give you a much different perspective. But even, with that, I think it's still a really entertaining film, which gives you a slice of New York. It allows you to kind of see the people and the places and the flea-bitten apartments and all of this stuff, and you really get a flavor, a feel for the time and the people and the place. Don't watch the public domain. There's a public domain DVD. It's not good. The MGM DVD is really, really excellent. And overall, just great acting. Great acting. Everybody, as I said, of course, you have that iconic performance by Boyle and his kind of, Hopalong Cassidy, Mr. Compton, Bill Compton, and then their wives who kind of, just kind of, again, play along. And I mean, even the two girls that the drug dealer boyfriend meets in the hall, and he hustles them some fake pills. Even they're great. I mean, like every performance in this film, I'm like, man, everybody is just so real and good and just doing their role to the hill. Everyone, such a great film, excellent performances. Joe, a real good film, real gem. A film from that era that is just overall just a cool, great movie.